In the heart of modern London, beneath the shadow of the Shard, lurks a secret as ancient as time. Meet Eldrich, a decrepit vampire, tormented by centuries of existence and a hunger he despises. He's a predator in the night, choosing victims who take more than they give, seeking justice in his own twisted way. In a city that never sleeps, a creature of the night hunts, haunted by a past that spans wars, revolutions, and the darkest chapters of humanity. But when Clara, an ambitious journalist, discovers his existence, their worlds collide in a tale of forbidden knowledge, philosophical revelations, and an unlikely connection. Dive into the shadows of London, where history and horror intertwine, and discover a story of a cursed being and a search for redemption in a world that has forgotten the meaning of the word. This is not just a tale of a vampire, it's a journey through the ages, a reflection of our own humanity. Shadow of the Shard, where the line between monster and man is blurred. Beneath the glittering lights of London's skyline, where the Shard pierced the heavens like a beacon of modernity, a darker truth lurked in the shadows. Here, in the forgotten underbelly of the city, prowled a creature of the night, a being whose very existence was a curse upon his soul. The vampire, known only as Eldrich, was a grotesque figure. His skin, once smooth and youthful, now hung from his bones like decaying parchment. His eyes, deep set and hollow, glimmered with a feral hunger. His hands, gnarled and claw-like, trembled with anticipation as he closed in on his prey. The alley was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a distant street lamp. A young man, lost in the throes of intoxication, stumbled through the darkness, unaware of the nightmare that awaited him. Eldrich moved with a predator's grace, his step silent as the grave. He was upon the man in an instant, his bony fingers gripping the victim's shoulder with an iron-like strength. The young man's scream was cut short as Eldrich's malformed mouth clamped over his neck. The vampire's teeth, jagged and yellowed, pierced flesh and vein with ease. The feed-in was nothing short of horrific, reminiscent of a leech draining its host. The man's lifeblood flowed into Eldrich, his body convulsing in the vampire's grasp. As Eldrich fed, his mind wandered, lost in the centuries of his cursed existence. He had been born in the Dark Ages, a time of superstition and fear. His transformation into a vampire had been a cruel twist of fate, a punishment for a sin long forgotten. He had wandered the continents, an outcast and a pariah, watching civilizations rise and fall. His journey had eventually brought him to London, a city that pulsed with life, and yet was filled with enough darkness to conceal his presence. Eldrich released the now lifeless body, a sense of self-loathing washing over him. Each life he took was a reminder of the monster he had become, a creature damned to walk the earth in eternal solitude. He retreated into the shadows, his form melting into the darkness. The ruins of the old monastery, hidden beneath the bustling streets of the city, awaited him. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could hide from the world and from himself. But tonight, unbeknownst to Eldrich, a pair of curious eyes had witnessed his gruesome act. A young journalist, in pursuit of a story that could make her career, had seen the impossible, and with that, the lives of the vampire and the journalist became irrevocably intertwined. Ah, my dear nocturnal scholars of the macabre, it's time for a quick scare break. As we linger in these shadowy realms, a small favour I dare to ask. If my tales of terror bring you thrills, do not let our journey end here. Hit like, subscribe, and join our dark congregation. Now shall we delve deeper into the abyss. Let's embrace the darkness once more. Let's get back to the shadows. Eldrich, in his centuries of existence, had been a silent observer of humanity's evolution, its triumphs and its downfalls. He had seen empires rise and fall, wars ravage continents, and revolutions change the course of history. But what struck him most was not the physical changes of the world, but the moral and philosophical transformations of mankind. As man's freedom, once cherished and fought for, gradually succumbed to the subtle encroachment of power, governments, under the guise of protection and order, had slowly extended their reach into the lives of their citizens. The invisible chains of control tightened, often unnoticed, as people traded liberty for the illusion of security. Eldrich mused upon the irony of his existence. Here he was, a creature of the night, a predator by nature, yet he found the actions of mankind more monstrous than his own. He had witnessed the horrors of war, the ruthless ambition of leaders, the manipulation of truth for power. These acts of violence and deception, perpetrated not by necessity but by choice, seemed far more abhorrent than his primal need to feed. In this new world order, individualism had become a casualty. The uniqueness of the individual, their right to live for themselves, to dream, to create, was overshadowed by the collective. People were no longer seen as independent beings, but as cogs in a larger machine, their worth measured by their utility to the state. Eldrich saw himself as a relic of a bygone era, a time when freedom and individualism were revered. Though he was a monster in form, he felt a kinship with those who dared to live for themselves, who resisted the tide of conformity and control. In his own twisted way, Eldrich justified his existence. Compared to the cold, calculating oppression of governments, his actions were mere survival. He was a creature of instinct, not malice. The vampire's thoughts were a reflection of the world he had witnessed, a world where the pursuit of power had overshadowed the pursuit of purpose, where the value of the individual had been diminished in the face of collective dominance. In this grand scheme of human history, Eldrich saw his own existence as a lesser evil, a dark but honest reflection of nature's law. The relentless hunger gnawed at Eldrich once more, a stark reminder of the curse that bound him to an eternal, loathsome existence. As night fell over London, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets, the vampire emerged from his sanctuary, a creature torn between his nature and his conscience. Eldrich roamed the city, a silent spectre in the darkness, his mind a battleground of conflicting thoughts. He abhorred his need to feed on others, to sustain his own cursed life, yet the primal urge to survive was a force too powerful to ignore. It was a vicious cycle of hunger and guilt, an existence he detested. In his centuries-long life, Eldrich had developed a peculiar code of ethics to justify his actions. He preyed not on the innocent, but on those who, in his eyes, had taken more from the world than they had given. To Eldrich, an honest man was one who did not consume more than he produced, who did not exploit others for personal gain. In a twisted interpretation of justice, he saw himself as a corrector of sorts, taken from those who had taken from others. As he stalked the shadowy streets, his keen senses attuned to the heartbeat of the city, Eldrich identified his next victim. A wealthy businessman, known for his ruthless tactics and unscrupulous dealings, the man had built his empire on the misfortunes of others. To Eldrich, he was the embodiment of the selfishness and greed that he despised in humanity. The vampire followed the businessman through the labyrinth of London's streets, moving with stealth and purpose. He watched as the man entered his luxurious apartment, unaware of the danger that lurked in the darkness. Eldrich made his move, swift and silent as a wraith. He confronted the businessman in the sanctity of his home, the place where he had orchestrated his many schemes. The vampire's eyes, cold and unyielding, met those of his victim. There was no plea for mercy, no struggle. It was as if, on some level, the man understood the inevitability of his fate. As Eldrich fed, draining the life from the corrupt businessman, he tried to convince himself that he was serving a greater good, that his actions were a form of retribution. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was a predator, driven by a hunger he could not control, forced to live a life that he despised. The feed-in was over quickly, and Eldrich left the lifeless body behind, a silent testament to his existence. He vanished into the night, his heart heavy with the burden of his nature, a creature doomed to walk the fine line between survival and morality. Eldrich's return to his sanctuary beneath the city was met with an unexpected surprise. There, in the heart of his hidden refuge, stood the young journalist who had witnessed his gruesome feeding. Her eyes widened in horror as she took in his ghastly appearance. The decaying skin, the sunken eyes, the aura of death that clung to him like a shroud. Instinctively, Eldrich reached for a tattered mask, an old weathered thing, to cover his hideous features. In a swift motion, born of centuries of survival, he moved to trap her within the confines of the monastery. The room, devoid of any windows and with only one door which he now guarded, became her prison. The journalist, realizing her predicament, steadied her breath, trying to mask her fear. You're not at all what I expected," she stammered, her voice tinged with a mix of fear and disgust. "I thought vampires were supposed to be seductive, eternally young." Eldrich, standing in the shadows, his face hidden behind the mask, let out a dry, humorless laugh. "The stories you humans tell about us are far from reality. We are not the romantic figures of your novels and films. We are predators, cursed creatures, and I am one of the oldest and farthest from your tales of seduction." Their conversation began tentatively. The journalist, whose name was Clara, revealed that she had been tracking Eldrich for some time, fascinated by the rumors of a real vampire in London. Her curiosity had led her to his lair, a decision she was now questioning. "Why do you kill?" Clara asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and fear. Eldrich sighed, a sound like rustling leaves. "I kill because I must. It is the curse of my existence. To live, I must feed, and to feed, I must take life. It is a cycle of hunger and survival, one I have endured for centuries." Clara listened, her journalistic instincts kicking in despite her situation. "But why choose those who have wronged others? Is there a reason behind your victims?" Eldrich paced the room, the weight of his eternal burden evident in his movement. "I suppose, in my own way, I seek to balance the scales. Those I feed on have taken more from the world than they have given. In my twisted view, I see it as a form of justice. But make no mistake, I am no hero. I am simply a monster, trying to justify his monstrous deeds." The conversation between predator and prey continued, a strange bond forming in the darkness of the ancient monastery. Clara, trapped yet fascinated, began to see the vampire not just as a subject for her story, but as a being tormented by his own existence. And Eldrich, for the first time in centuries, found himself engaging in a genuine human connection, albeit under the most peculiar circumstances. In the dim light of the ancient monastery, Eldrich began to share his burdensome history with Clara. His voice, low and resonant, echoed through the stone walls as he recounted the centuries of pain and suffering he had witnessed. "I have seen the darkest corners of human history," Eldrich began, his tone reflecting a profound weariness. "Wars that ravaged lands and decimated populations, uprisings that toppled empires and left chaos in their wake. I have watched political parties engage in deceitful tactics, sacrificing their integrity for power and control. The amount of death and human suffering I've witnessed is beyond what any soul should endure. Clara, her initial fear subsiding, listened intently, her eyes fixed on the shadowy figure before her. She could sense the deep sorrow in his words, a sorrow that came from centuries of witnessing humanity's worst. Eldrich paused, collecting his thoughts. Throughout my existence, I've had to justify my actions, my need to feed, to myself. When I look at the world, at how it treats its people, the injustices and cruelties, I tell myself that my actions are a mere drop in an ocean of human suffering. What are my few thousand kills compared to the millions who have died at the hands of their own kind? He continued, his voice growing firmer. In this world, I have seen the triumph of collectivism over individualism. People are often treated as mere tools for the ambitions of others, their own dreams and aspirations crushed under the weight of collective agendas. In such a world, where the value of the individual is so easily disregarded, my existence, my need to feed, seems almost inconsequential. Clara could hear the echoes of a philosophy in his words, one that revered the individual and their right to live for themselves, free from the imposition of others. Eldrich, in his own way, saw himself as an individual acting out of necessity, in stark contrast to the deliberate choices of humans who caused harm on a grand scale. The world has shown me that it values power over principle, control over freedom. In this grand scheme, my actions, driven by survival, seem less monstrous compared to the deliberate cruelties of mankind. As Eldrich spoke, Clara began to understand the complex morality that governed his existence. He was a creature of the night, a predator by nature, but his perspective on humanity and its failings was surprisingly profound. In his words, she found not only the story she had been seeking, but also a deeper insight into the nature of good and evil, right and wrong. As the hours passed, the conversation between Eldrich and Clara had delved into the depths of philosophy, history, and morality. However, the inevitable call of Eldrich's nature began to resurface. The hunger and ever-present torment gnawed at him with renewed urgency. He glanced at Clara, her presence a stark reminder of his predatory nature. Yet, as he looked at her, he realized he could not, would not harm her. She was not one of those who took from others without giving back. Eldrich stood abruptly, the urgency of his hunger evident in his movements. "I must feed," he confessed, his voice strained, "but not on you. I seek those who contribute nothing but take everything. You are free to go. Do as you see fit with what you have learned." With those words, he vanished into the night, leaving Clara alone in the ancient sanctuary. Eldrich moved through the city with a singular focus, seeking a victim who fit his criteria. He found his next prey in the form of a corrupt politician, a man whose career was built on lies and manipulation, thriving at the expense of those he was supposed to serve. Eldrich's feed-in was swift and merciless. As he drained the life from the politician, his mind was a tumult of emotion, hunger, satisfaction, and an ever-present loathing for his existence. Returning to the sanctuary, Eldrich expected to find it empty, Clara long gone, possibly ready to expose his dark secret to the world. To his surprise, she was still there, her expression contemplative. "Why didn't you run? You could have exposed me, benefited from the story of a lifetime," Eldrich asked, his voice laced with a mix of curiosity and resignation. Clara turned to face him, her eyes reflecting a newfound understanding. "Your words resonated with me more than you realize. I've always sensed the truth in what you said, but I could never quite piece it together. The world, the media, everything seems designed to prevent us from seeing the full picture." Eldrich nodded, understanding her sentiment. "That is the essence of control. Governments and those in power maintain their position by pretending to be essential, indispensable. It creates a dependency, a belief in the people that they are not complete, not important on their own. It's a way to keep the status quo, to ensure that the power remains with those who already have it." Clara listened, absorbing his words. "It's like we're all just pieces in a larger game, one where the rules are made to benefit to those who are already winning." Eldrich agreed. "Exactly. And in this game, the individual, their dreams, aspirations and freedoms are often overlooked or sacrificed. What I am, what I do, it's monstrous. But in the grand scheme of things, there are greater monsters out there, hidden behind veils of legitimacy and authority." Their conversation continued into the night. Two souls, one human, one not, finding common ground in their understanding of the world's complexities. Clara, with her newfound insights, and Eldrich, with his eternal burden, shared a moment of unexpected connection in the heart of the ancient sanctuary. Clara, her eyes reflecting a mixture of empathy and horror, posed a question that hung heavily in the air. "Why don't you just end it all? It must be terrible existing like this." Eldrich, his gaze distant, responded with a weary voice. "I have tried, Clara. I have sought the release of death more times than I can count." He lifted his shirt, revealing a scar over his heart, a stark reminder of his failed attempt at self-destruction. Sunlight, a stake through the heart, garlic, mirrors, guns, knives. I've tried them all. Each attempt only brings more injury, more pain, and the only respite from that pain is to feed. The more I hurt, the more I need to feed. I dare not push myself further, for fear of reaching a point where my existence becomes nothing but a perpetual cycle of taking life." Clara watched, her heart aching for the tormented creature before her. "Have you ever considered what it's like to have a wound that never heals, a wound that constantly brings pain, and the only temporary remedy is to feed on blood?" Eldrich continued, his voice laced with a profound sorrow. He began to speak of the countless men he had seen rise and fall throughout the ages, men consumed by their lust for power. "I've watched as they've clawed their way to the top, using force, manipulation, taking from others without a second thought. Their hunger for power, for control, it's no different from my own hunger for blood. But unlike me, their actions are choices, driven by selfish desires, not survival." Eldrich's philosophy, deeply influenced by his observations of human nature, mirrored the thoughts of those who believed in the sanctity of the individual. In this world, power is often obtained at the expense of others. Men, in their pursuit of control, strip away the rights and freedoms of individuals, treating them as means to an end. It's a world where the value of a person is measured by what they can contribute to someone else's ambition. Clara listened intently, her mind racing with the implications of his words. Eldrich's perspective, though born from a supernatural existence, shed light on the darker aspects of human nature and society. His life, a tapestry of suffering and survival, was a testament to the enduring struggle between the individual and the collective, between the pursuit of power and the preservation of self. In that moment, Clara realized the depth of Eldrich's torment. He was not just a monster of folklore, but a being who had endured the ages, witnessing the recurring cycles of human ambition and the cost it imposed on the individual spirit. His existence, a perpetual battle against his own nature, was a mirror to the struggles faced by humanity itself. Eldrich, his eyes betraying a hint of melancholy, turned to Clara. "I have enjoyed our conversation. It has been a welcome distraction from my pain, but you must leave now and never return." Clara, puzzled and somewhat saddened by his sudden request, asked, "Why? If you've enjoyed my company, why can't I come here and speak with you? It could be a trade. You share your pain and have the company you long for, and I could learn so much about history and your experiences." In response, Eldrich slowly retrieved a faded, hand-drawn picture from an old, dusty box. The picture depicted a woman, her features delicate and full of life. "I am condemned to live forever, Clara. Every time I find solace in something or someone, time snatches it away from me, just as it took her." He pointed to the woman in the drawing. "She was my love, and I had to watch her age and die. The more I dare to care, the more I am reminded of my curse. I cannot afford to grow fond of you." Clara, undeterred, retorted with a concept that resonated with Eldrich's long-held beliefs, yet seemed to have faded from his memory. "Isn't life about exchange? Your company for my knowledge? Even if it's only for a short while, shouldn't an exchange be fair and valuable to both parties involved?" Eldrich looked at her in astonishment. For so long he had distanced himself from humanity. He had forgotten one of the core principles he once valued, the idea of a fair exchange, where two individuals interact not as a sacrifice of one to the other, but as a mutual benefit, each gaining something from the other. Clara's words echoed the philosophy of individualism and purpose, a philosophy that respected the sanctity of personal values and the importance of mutual, consensual benefit in human relationships. It was a stark contrast to the forced taking and involuntary sacrifices he had grown accustomed to in his existence. The realization dawned on Eldrich that, despite his eternal curse, there could still be meaningful, albeit temporary connections that were not based on taking or feeding, but on sharing and mutual gain. Clara's presence, her willingness to learn and understand, offered him a glimpse of an interaction that was based on equal value, not exploitation. After a moment of contemplation, Eldrich nodded slowly. "Perhaps you are right. Perhaps there is still room for fair exchange, even in a life as cursed as mine." The agreement marked the beginning of an unusual but profound relationship, where knowledge and companionship were exchanged between two vastly different beings, each finding value in the other's existence. For Clara, it was an opportunity to learn from a living piece of history, and for Eldrich, it was a chance to connect with humanity in a way he had long thought impossible. Eldrich sat quietly in the opulent home of a known fraudster, a man whose lavish lifestyle was funded by deceit and the misfortunes of others. He had tracked the man meticulously, blending into the shadows, observing his every move. This individual, in Eldrich's eyes, represented the epitome of those who took without giving, exploiting the vulnerable for personal gain. As the fraudster returned home, unaware of the presence that lurked within, Eldrich prepared to feed. The act was swift, a silent dance of predator and prey, ending with the fraudster's lifeless body slumped on the floor. Eldrich stood over him, a mix of disgust and contentment on his face. The deed was done, another taker of innocence removed, yet the taste of blood was a bitter reminder of his cursed existence. Upon returning to his sanctuary, Eldrich found Clara waiting for him. "Ah, Clara," he greeted her, a hint of warmth in his otherwise cold demeanour. "Let me tell you about the last woman I befriended. I met her in Russia, and then again in America." He began to recount his interaction with a remarkable woman, whose ideas and philosophy had left a lasting impression on him. Though he did not mention her name, his description painted the picture of a brilliant mind, a thinker who championed the rights of the individual, the importance of personal freedom, and the pursuit of one's own happiness. She spoke of a world where people lived for themselves, not at the mercy of others, where one's achievements were the result of their own efforts, not taken from them by force or deceit. We talked at length, our philosophies intertwining yet distinct. She saw the world with a clarity that few possessed, understanding the value of the individual in a collective society. As Eldrich shared his memories, Clara listened intently, piecing together the identity of this mysterious woman from history. It was clear that their conversations had left a profound impact on Eldrich, providing a rare moment of connection in his solitary existence. As the night drew to a close, the air in the ancient monastery was filled with a sense of understanding and shared knowledge. Clara, now more intrigued than ever, realized that Eldrich's story was far from over. There were more secrets to uncover, more of history to unravel through the eyes of this eternal witness. The story ended there, but the door was left open. Eldrich's existence, spanning centuries and continents, held more tales, more insights into the human condition, and Clara, with her insatiable curiosity and newfound connection to the vampire, was just at the beginning of uncovering the depths of Eldrich's long and tormented journey. The stage was set for a sequel, for more stories to be told, more secrets to be revealed, in the unusual bond between a vampire and a journalist. The darkness was absolute, a suffocating heavy blanket that seemed to press down on John's chest with an almost physical weight. His eyelids flickered open, but it made no difference. Blackness enveloped him, unyielding and complete. Panic clawed at his throat, a raw, primal fear that he had never known before. His breath came in short, sharp gasps, the sound unnaturally loud in the cramped space. He tried to move, but the realization hit him like a physical blow. He was confined in a space too small to even fully extend his arms. The air was stale, filled with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something faintly metallic that he couldn't quite identify. His heart hammered against his ribcage, a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo around him. Where was he? How did he get here? The question spun in his mind, but no answers came. There were only fragments, disjointed images that flashed through his mind. A walk home on a chilly night, the rustling of leaves, a sudden sharp pain. He reached out, his fingers brushing against smooth, unyielding wood, just inches from his face. A coffin. The word echoed through his mind, a silent scream of disbelief and horror. He was buried alive. The thought was so terrifying, so incomprehensible, that for a moment his mind recoiled from it. He pounded on the lid of the coffin, his fists beating against the wood in a frenzy. The sound was muffled, the thick earth above him absorbing the noise, rendering his efforts futile. His throat was raw from shouting, the words lost in the small, enclosed space. His mind raced, trying to piece together the events that had led him here, but it was like trying to grasp smoke. The more he tried to remember, the more elusive the memories became. There were only flashes, brief glimpses that made no sense. A shadowy figure, a feeling of being watched, a sharp, sudden pain, and then nothing. As the initial surge of panic began to ebb, a cold, creeping dread took its place. He was alone in this dark, silent tomb. No one knew where he was. No one was coming to save him. The air seemed to grow thinner, harder to breathe. Each breath was a struggle, each gulp of air less satisfying than the last. The darkness pressed in on him from all sides, a tangible presence that seemed almost alive, a smothering, suffocating entity that revelled in his fear. John's mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion, but one thought rose above the rest, clear and chilling in its finality. He was going to die here, alone and forgotten, in this dark, silent grave. The last thing he felt was the overwhelming weight of the earth above him, a heavy, unrelenting pressure that promised to crush the life from his body, burying him in an eternal, unending darkness. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. In the stifling darkness of his earthen prison, John's mind began to drift, clawing desperately at the scattered remnants of his past life. Memories floated to the surface, distant and hazy, like scenes viewed through a fogged glass. He saw himself at work, a place he had once considered a second home, a battleground of ideals and ambitions. John had been part of a committee, a position of influence and power. He remembered the weight of responsibility, the burden of leadership. They were a union, united in their cause, demanding more from the company, more money, more benefits, a fairer slice of the corporate pie. The memory of their rallying cries echoed in his mind, a chorus of voices, demanding what they believed was rightfully theirs. He recalled the meetings, the passionate speeches about equality and justice. They spoke of a fair share for all, regardless of ability or contribution. Each member of the union, from the janitors to the senior technicians, deserved an equal portion of the company's success. It was a noble cause, or so he had believed. But in the silent darkness of the coffin, those ideals twisted into something else. They seemed like a mockery of the very principles he had championed. The collective good, the unifying goal of the union, now seemed like a demand for more than they had produced, a claim on the fruits of others' labours. They had sought to level the playing field, not by raising the lowest, but by pulling down the highest, redistributing the rewards without regard for the effort. John remembered the strikes, the picket lines, the fervent speeches about solidarity and rights. But now, those memories were tainted with a new understanding. Had they been champions of fairness, or had they been parasites, leeching off the creativity and hard work of others? The union had been his family, his identity. He had led them, fought for them, believed in their cause. But here, in the suffocating darkness, those beliefs crumbled like dry earth. The noble cause he had fought for seemed now like a thin veneer, covering a more selfish desire, the desire for more, regardless of the means to achieve it. As these revelations swirled in his mind, John felt a profound sense of loss, not just for his life, but for the ideals he had once held so dear. The darkness around him seemed to grow even more oppressive, a physical manifestation of the doubt and guilt that now gnawed at his soul. He lay there, in the unyielding grip of the earth, his body a mere shell, while his mind wrestled with the shadows of his past. The man he had been, the beliefs he had held, they seemed like relics of a life now irrevocably lost, buried under the weight of a harsher, crueler truth. Chapter 3. The Suffocating Dark. John's breaths were shallow. each inhalation a laborious effort in the cramped confines of his coffin. The air, thick and stale, seemed to grow scarcer with each passing moment. His lungs screamed for relief, for a breath of fresh, cool air that would never come. The oppressive darkness was unrelenting, a tangible presence that seemed to press against his skin, smothering him in its embrace. Panic surged within him, a tidal wave of terror that threatened to overwhelm his senses. His heart pounded in his chest, a frenetic drumbeat that echoed in his ears. The claustrophobic space seemed to shrink around him, the walls of the coffin closing in, inching ever closer. The weight of the earth above felt like a mountain, a massive force crushing down upon him. John's fingers clawed at the lid of the coffin, scraping and scratching in a futile attempt to escape. His nails tore, the pain sharp and real, but it was nothing compared to the terror that gripped his heart. The sound of his own frantic scratching was maddening, a constant reminder of his desperate situation. His mind raced, thoughts colliding and spinning in a chaotic whirl. Memories of open skies, wide spaces, and the freedom of movement tormented him, a cruel contrast to his current entrapment. The darkness seemed to seep into his very soul, a blackness so complete it threatened to erase all sense of self. Time lost meaning in the pitch black of his tomb. Seconds stretched into minutes, minutes into hours, each moment an eternity of fear and suffocation. John's body trembled, not just from the lack of oxygen, but from the sheer terror of his predicament. But then, something shifted. In the impenetrable blackness, a change so subtle it was almost imperceptible. John blinked, his eyes straining in the darkness. There was no light, no glimmer to break the relentless night that surrounded him. Yet, something was different. Gradually, almost fearfully, he realized that his vision was beginning to adapt. The darkness, once an unyielding curtain, seemed to take on depth and texture. It was as if his eyes were attuning to the night, discerning shapes and shades where before there had been only an abyss. John's heart, still racing, now thudded with a mix of fear and wonder. What was happening to him? Was his mind playing tricks, a last, desperate attempt to find hope in the hopeless? Or was something else at work, something beyond his understanding? John lying in his grave, the darkness around him no longer a complete void. It was a revelation that brought no comfort, only a deeper sense of foreboding. The transformation of his vision was a mystery, one that hinted at changes yet to come, changes that might be as terrifying as the darkness that had so completely enveloped him. Chapter 4. The Transformation. As John lay in the darkness, his newfound vision piercing the black veil of the coffin, his mind reeled with fragmented memories. They came to him in flashes, each one more vivid than the last. He remembered walking home, the streets eerily quiet, the night air crisp against his skin. And then there was the man. No, not a man. Something else. Something ancient and decayed. The figure had emerged from the shadows, his presence suffused with an air of timelessness. His eyes were like two dark pools, drawing John in with a terrifying allure. "I am Eldrich," the figure had said, his voice a whisper that seemed to echo from centuries past. Before John could react, the man, Eldrich, was upon him, his teeth sinking into John's neck with a pain so sharp it burned into his memory. Now, as he lay in the coffin, those memories solidified into a horrifying realization. Eldrich had done something to him, something unnatural. As this understanding settled in his mind, John noticed the changes in his body. It was not just his vision that had altered. There was a newfound strength coursing through his veins, a power that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. But it was the hunger that truly unnerved him. It hit him like a physical force, a need so deep and primal that it eclipsed all other sensations. It was a thirst, but not for water or any normal sustenance. This was a hunger for life, for the essence that flowed in the veins of the living. The desire to feed was overwhelming, an irresistible pull that dominated his every thought. John felt his body changing, transforming into something else, something otherworldly. He was here, in the coffin, yet he felt almost interdimensional, as if part of him existed in a different plane. This sensation was disorienting, yet it imbued him with a sense of power he had never known. As he lay there, feeling the hunger gnawing at him, John became acutely aware of the depth of his grave. He could sense the layers of earth above him, the weight of the soil, the distance to the surface. But with this new, inexplicable strength surging within him, he started to believe that he could escape. The coffin, the earth, these were no longer insurmountable barriers. They were merely obstacles to be overcome. John, still trapped in the darkness, but now transformed. He was no longer just a man buried alive. He was something else, a creature of the night, endowed with strange powers and an insatiable hunger. The realization of what he had become and what he might be capable of filled him with a mix of fear and anticipation. As the last line was written, John was preparing himself to break free from his grave, to emerge into a world that would no longer see him as human. Chapter 5. The Pact and the Punishment. John's hands, now imbued with the strength he had never known, pressed against the lid of the coffin. To his astonishment, it moved. Was this newfound power a product of sheer desperation, or something more? He pushed again, more confidently this time, and with a sudden burst of force, he smashed through the wooden barrier. Earth cascaded upon him, a shower of soil and darkness, but it was inconsequential. He brushed it aside, as if it were mere dust, digging upwards with an ease that defied belief. His hand broke through the surface, clawing into the cool night air. With a few more movements, he emerged fully from the grave, standing tall amidst the tombstones. The world around him was bathed in the glow of the moon, a landscape transformed by his new vision, sharp and clear, even in the dead of night. As he took in his surroundings, a voice cut through the silence. "About time," it said, dry and ancient. John turned to see Eldrich standing there, the very embodiment of decay. His skin hung off his face like aged leather, a far cry from the romanticized vampires of movies. He was a grotesque testament to the ravages of time, a creature both terrifying and awe-inspiring. "You did this to me?" John said, his voice a mix of accusation and wonder. "Yes," Eldrich replied, his eyes glinting with an unfathomable depth. "You feel the hunger. I do too. But listen well. My power is ancient, far beyond your understanding. You will abide by my rules. You shall only take the life of those who take more from this world than they contribute. The reverse is forbidden. If you defy this, the consequences will be dire." John's new vision seemed to grant him more than just sight in darkness. It provided a clarity of understanding, an instant comprehension of Eldrich's words. The ancient vampire continued, "This is not a gift, but a curse. Forget the myths of stakes and sunlight. Death is not an escape for us. Should you be wounded, the injury will remain forever, a constant agony only eased temporarily by the feed." John stood there, absorbing the gravity of Eldrich's words. He realized with chilling clarity that his previous life had been one of imbalance, of taking more than he had given, far more than most men. Was this transformation, this curse, a punishment for his past actions? The irony was bitter. In seeking more for himself and his peers, he had now become a creature bound by a terrifyingly strict moral code, enforced not by society, but by the very nature of his cursed existence. John stood in the cemetery, a figure caught between two worlds. The night was no longer a canvas of darkness, but a realm of heightened senses and cruel truths. He understood Eldrich's warning and the unspoken threat that lay beneath. His journey into this new, dark existence was just beginning, and the path ahead promised to be as tortuous as it was eternal. Chapter 6. A New Purpose. As quickly as he had appeared, Eldrich vanished into the night, leaving John alone with his thoughts and his new, terrifying reality. He stumbled into the street, his movements awkward, still unfamiliar with the strength and agility of his transformed body. The world around him was a tapestry of sharp details and heightened senses, yet he felt disconnected, a ghost wandering in a realm that was no longer his own. Catching his reflection in a shop window, John recoiled at the sight. His eyes, once full of life, were now sunken, his features gaunt, resembling more a corpse than a living man. He looked away in disgust, a profound sense of self-loathing washing over him. This reflection was a constant reminder of what he had become, a creature of the night, a being that defied the natural order. Yet, amidst this revulsion, a new resolve began to form within him. With his heightened senses and clarity of vision, John realized he had an opportunity to redefine his existence. He would no longer be a parasite, a drain on the hard-working and the productive. Instead, he would become the leech of those who preyed upon them, a dark avenger in the shadows. Memories of his former life, of the people he had stood with, those who had demanded more from others than they were willing to give, flooded his mind. He remembered their faces, their words, their justifications for taking from those who had labored to create and produce. These were the people he would seek out, not to join them, but to deliver a twisted form of justice. John's mind was clear, his purpose defined. He would hunt those who exploited the efforts of others, who sought to gain without giving in return. In this dark crusade, he would find a semblance of redemption, a way to balance the scales that he had once helped tip in the wrong direction. As the chapter came to a close, John faded into the night, a spectre of vengeance and retribution. His path was set, a journey that would lead him into the depths of human greed and corruption. He was no longer just a survivor of a cruel fate. He was an arbiter of a dark and ruthless justice. The night was his domain, and in its shadows he would find his new purpose. In the shadowed streets of London, an ancient evil rises. Valerian, a vampire of untold power, unleashes a reign of terror, feeding without mercy. The city trembles under his wrath, its people helpless before his might. But from the darkness emerges Eldrich, the vampire with a conscience, forced to confront his own kind. As Valerian's savage spree threatens to engulf the city, Eldrich faces a harrowing choice: to embrace the power of a mysterious talisman and confront his nemesis, or to remain true to his twisted moral code. In a race against time, Eldrich must navigate a perilous path of ancient rituals, unlikely alliances, and philosophical battles. The Crimson Shadow of London, where the lines between monster and hero blur, and the fate of a city hangs in the balance. London, a city steeped in history and shrouded in modern mystery, found itself under a new shadow, one darker and more sinister than it had ever known. It began as a whisper in the night, a rumor on the lips of the city's underworld, about a new presence, something ancient and terrifying. The night was unusually cold. the moon a mere sliver in the cloudy sky above. In the heart of the city, where the neon lights clashed with the Gothic architecture, the new vampire made his entrance. He was a figure of elegance and horror, his movements graceful yet predatory. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, surveying his new hunting ground with an air of ownership. His first victim was a lone businessman, stumbling out of a late-night establishment, his senses dulled by excess. The vampire moved with a speed that was almost invisible, a blur in the night. Before the man could process the danger, he was ensnared, held in an iron grip as the vampire fed. Feeding was brutal and efficient, a stark contrast to the vampire's refined appearance. The man's life was drained in mere moments, his body discarded in the shadow of an alley, another lost soul in the city of millions. Word of the attack spread like wildfire through the city's supernatural circles. Eyewitnesses spoke of the vampire's ferocity, his blatant disregard for concealment. Each night that followed brought more victims, each attack more daring than the last. The city's homeless, its night workers, even the occasional reveler, none were safe from this new predator. As the death toll rose, so did the fear. This was not the careful, selective feeding of a discreet vampire. This was a spree of carnage, a statement of power. The new vampire was sending a message. London was his for the taking. Meanwhile, in the hidden corners of the city, the vampire community began to stir. This reckless display was a threat to their existence, a violation of the unspoken rules that had kept their kind safe for centuries. Among them, a name was whispered, a name that carried weight and fear: Eldrich. But for now, he remained a shadow, watching, waiting. The chapter ends with a new vampire standing atop one of London's historic bridges, looking out over the city. His eyes glowed with anticipation and hunger. London, a city that had seen so much, was about to witness a new chapter in its ancient history. The crimson shadow of London had arrived. Ah, my dear nocturnal scholars of the macabre, it's time for a quick scare break. As we linger in these shadowy realms, a small favour I dare to ask. If my tales of terror bring you thrills, do not let our journey end here. Hit like, subscribe, and join our dark congregation. Now shall we delve deeper into the abyss. Let's embrace the darkness once more. Let's get back to the shadows. Chapter 2. The Rise of Valerian. The new terror haunting London's streets had a name that echoed through the centuries: Valerian. His story was one steeped in darkness and power, a tale that began in the forgotten annals of Eastern European folklore. Valerian was born into nobility, his lineage ancient and esteemed. From a young age, he was exposed to the harsh realities of power and the cold necessities of maintaining it. He grew up in a world where mercy was a weakness and cruelty a tool as sharp as any blade. When he was turned into a vampire in the turbulent years of the Middle Ages, these traits only intensified. Over the centuries, Valerian's reputation grew. He was known not just for his ruthless nature, but also for his extraordinary powers. Unlike most of his kind, Valerian possessed strength and abilities that surpassed those of ordinary vampires. He could move with such speed that he appeared to vanish into thin air, and his strength could crush stone. His senses were so acute that he could hear the heartbeat of a nervous prey from streets away. But what truly set him apart was his ability to manipulate the minds of others, bending them to his will with little more than a glance. Valerian's emergence in London was no accident. He had come seeking something, a relic of power that was rumoured to be hidden within the city's ancient foundations. This relic, a vestige of the vampire's early history, was said to grant immense power to whoever possessed it. Valerian, ever hungry for more strength, was determined to find it. His disdain for a moral code stemmed from his belief in his own superiority. To Valerian, morality was a constraint designed by the weak to control the strong. In his eyes, his vampiric nature was not a curse, but a testament to his superiority, a means to rise above the limitations of ordinary beings. As Valerian's reign of terror continued, the streets of London grew more fearful with each passing night. His attacks were not just feeding, they were displays of power meant to instill terror and assert his dominance over the city. Chapter 3. The Reluctant Alliance. Clara, the intrepid journalist who had once uncovered the existence of Eldrich, the vampire with a conscience, found herself once again drawn into the shadowy world of the supernatural. The city was abuzz with rumors and fear about the string of gruesome attacks, and Clara's instincts told her that these were no ordinary crimes. Determined to uncover the truth, she delved into the heart of London's dark underbelly, piecing together the chilling accounts of Valerian's reign of terror. Armed with this information, Clara made her way to the hidden sanctuary of Eldrich. The vampire listened intently as Clara recounted her findings, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. "Eldrich, you must know who this is," Clara implored, sensing his recognition. Eldrich sighed, a sound like the whisper of leaves. "Yes, I know of Valerian. His reputation precedes him, a being of immense power and little restraint. But you can stop him, right? You've faced others before," Clara urged, her voice tinged with hope. Eldrich shook his head, his eyes reflecting a deep, unspoken fear. "Valerian is different. His strength, his abilities, they far exceed my own. A direct confrontation would leave me injured beyond repair." Clara's brow furrowed in confusion. "But the myths, sunlight, silver, stakes, can't they kill a vampire?" Eldrich let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Those tales are just that, myths. Sunlight, silver, stakes, garlic. They can injure us, yes, but they cannot kill. We are cursed to endure, to suffer. If you were to cut off my head, I would still be alive, trapped in eternal agony." The gravity of Eldrich's words hung heavy in the air. Clara realized the true horror of his existence, a life of unending pain and solitude. "But why is Valerian here in London? What does he want?" Clara asked, her journalistic instincts kicking in. Eldrich's gaze turned distant, thoughtful. "He's here for something, a relic of great power, a talisman, ancient and imbued with energies that can amplify a vampire's abilities. If Valerian gets his hands on it, the destruction he could unleash would be unimaginable." Clara's eyes widened. "Then we must find it before he does?" Eldrich nodded slowly. "Yes, if I can find the talisman first, I might be able to stop him. It won't be easy, but it's our only chance." Determined, Clara and Eldrich set out to unravel the mystery of the talisman's location. The chapter closes with them poring over ancient texts and cryptic maps, a race against time to find the relic before Valerian can claim its power. In the shadows of London, an unlikely alliance was formed, one that held the fate of the city in its hands. Chapter 4. The Cult of the Night. Valerian, the powerful vampire stalking the streets of London, had traced the rumoured location of the talisman to a notorious crime boss. As he sat across from the crime lord in a dimly lit, secluded room, he viewed his host with disdain, seeing him as nothing more than an insect. The crime boss, surrounded by his burly guards, was initially amused by Valerian's presence. "What do you want?" And what can you offer me for it?" he asked with a smug grin. "This is not a trade," Valerian replied coldly, his eyes piercing through the dim light. "This is a demand. Give me the talisman, and you and your men will live." The crime boss laughed, a sound that echoed off the walls. "You are outnumbered, and we are armed. What possible threat can you be to me and my men?" In a blink of an eye, the atmosphere in the room shifted from amusement to terror. Valerian moved with the speed that was almost invisible, a blur of shadow and death. Before anyone could react, the burly men fell to the floor, each taken down with lethal precision. The crime boss looked around in horror, realizing he was now alone amidst the bodies of his guards. "Now we are even," Valerian stated calmly. "I suggest you hand over the talisman." Shaking with fear, the boss stammered, I don't have it. I sold it to the Cult of the Night." The Cult of the Night, as Valerian knew, was an ancient and secretive organization, steeped in mysticism and the occult. They were collectors of relics and artifacts, believers in the supernatural powers that such objects could bestow. This cult operated in the shadows, their members a mystery, their gatherings shrouded in secrecy. They were not mere enthusiasts of the occult. They were practitioners, capable of wielding the energies contained within these artifacts. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Valerian's next move was clear. He needed to find the Cult of the Night and retrieve the talisman before it could be used, or worse, fall into hands even more dangerous than his own. In a room filled with ancient artifacts and shadowy figures, Eldrich sat across from the enigmatic head of the Cult of the Night, known only as Marcellus. The air was thick with the scent of old books and burning incense, the walls adorned with symbols whose meanings were lost to time. Eldrich spoke with a calm urgency. "You understand that Valerian seeks the talisman to bring evil and destruction upon this city. I ask only to borrow it, to stop him. I assure you, it will be returned once the deed is done." Marcellus, his face obscured by a hood, listened intently. His voice, when he spoke, was like the rustling of leaves on an ancient tree. "The talisman you seek is not merely a tool. It's a vessel of immense power. Its history is as old as our order, passed down through generations. It has the ability to amplify the innate powers of its user, but at a great cost. It can corrupt the mind, instilling a thirst for power that can consume even the strongest will." He paused, his eyes old and wise fixed on Eldrich. "I have known you for a long time, Eldrich. I have seen your struggles, your attempts to adhere to a moral code in a world that constantly challenges it. You live by a principle that few understand, the belief in never living for another man, in preserving your own values and purpose, despite the curse that plagues you. This philosophy, this unwavering commitment to your own moral code, is what sets you apart." Marcellus leaned forward, the shadows dancing across his face. "If anyone could wield the talisman without falling prey to its corrupting influence, it would be you. Your resolve, your dedication to your principles, makes you the only viable candidate." The chapter ends with a heavy silence hanging in the air. Marcellus, the guardian of ancient secrets, had acknowledged Eldrich's unique moral strength, yet the talisman remained in his possession. The decision to entrust such a powerful artifact to Eldrich was fraught with peril, and Marcellus was not yet ready to make that choice. Eldrich sat, his fate and the fate of London hanging in the balance, waiting for the decision that would determine their next move in the dangerous game against Valerian. The Cult of the Night, with its ancient wisdom and hidden power, held the key, but would they entrust it to the vampire with a conscience? The air in the room thickened with tension as Eldrich and Marcellus conversed. their discussion cut abruptly short by a sudden, violent eruption. The door burst open with the force of a tempest, the power of Valerian making its devastating entrance. He stormed in, leaving a trail of destruction and bodies in his wake, his presence a storm of malevolent energy. "Well, what have we here?" Valerian's voice boomed, echoing through the chamber. His eyes settled on Eldrich. "Eldrich, the outdated vampire. I believe you have something of mine," he sneered, turning his gaze to Marcellus. Two more members of the Cult of the Night, brave but hopelessly outmatched, rushed towards Valerian, only to be instantly dispatched by his overwhelming power. The air crackled with his dark energy, the room itself seeming to shrink in his presence. "You know you cannot defeat me," Valerian taunted, his eyes fixed on Eldrich. "Just give me the talisman. It holds the power to finally end your life, Eldrich. Think of it. Eternal peace." Eldrich, his face a mask of conflict and hope, seemed to contemplate the offer for a moment. Then, with a resolute voice, he turned to Marcellus. "Give it to me." Marcellus, understanding the gravity of the moment, passed the talisman to Eldrich. The transformation was instant, a blinding explosion of light that filled the room. The talisman not only amplified Eldrich's powers, his speed and mental ability, but also reversed all his injuries, even the effects of age. Eldrich stood there, rejuvenated and empowered, the energy of the talisman coursing through him like a living force. Valerian began to clap slowly, a sardonic smile on his lips. "Well done," he said mockingly. "Even with that power, you still do not possess the strength to stop me." Chapter 7. The Ideological Duel. As the energy of the talisman coursed through him, Eldrich faced Valerian, his voice steady and resonant. "You seek power that does not rightfully belong to you, Valerian. To take from others without offering anything in return is the lowest form of existence. It's a path of weakness, not strength." Eldrich continued, his words echoing through the chamber. "True strength, true power comes from within, from the ability to create, to add value to the world, not from dominating others or taking what is not yours. You seek to master everything and everyone, but such desire only reveals your own emptiness. A world where one rules by fear and oppression is a world devoid of real achievement, real progress." Valerian listened, his expression one of amusement and contempt. "Ah, Eldrich, still clinging to your outdated ideals. You fail to understand the basic nature of mankind. People do not seek freedom, they seek comfort, security. They are willing to trade their liberties for the illusion of safety. They crave leadership, direction. It is in their nature to be ruled, to be led." He stepped closer, his power radiating off him like a dark aura. "In a world where everyone seeks their own selfish desires, chaos reigns. There must be order, control, and who better to provide that than one who stands above them all? It is not about taking for the sake of taking, Eldrich. It's about bringing order to a world incapable of governing itself." Eldrich met Valerian's gaze, his own power an unyielding force. "You mistake control for order, Valerian. A society built on the principles of individual freedom, where each person lives for their own sake, guided by their own rational judgment, is the only society that can truly thrive. Your vision of order is nothing but tyranny, a world where individuals are subjugated, their spirits crushed under the weight of your so-called leadership." Their exchange of words, a clash of philosophies, set the stage for the impending physical confrontation. Eldrich, empowered by the talisman and his own convictions, stood ready to defend a world where individuals could live freely, unoppressed by the likes of Valerian. Valerian, confident in his power and belief in his destined rule, prepared to impose his vision of order upon the world. The tension between them reaching a fever pitch, a battle of ideologies about to erupt into a battle of ancient powers. The fate of London, and perhaps the broader world, hung in the balance as Eldrich and Valerian prepared to clash, not just in might, but in the very ideals that defined their existence. Chapter 8. The Decisive Battle. Valerian, his eyes ablaze with fury and power, launched himself at Eldrich with a speed that would have been a blur to any ordinary observer. But Eldrich was no longer ordinary. Empowered by the talisman, his senses heightened to an extraordinary level. He saw Valerian's movements with crystal clarity. As Valerian charged, Eldrich deftly maneuvered out of his path, his own movements enhanced by the talisman's energy. Valerian's relentless attacks, fueled by speed and anger, were formidable, but Eldrich, aided by the talisman, evaded each strike with surprising agility. Seizing the moment, Eldrich summoned his newfound power and unleashed a savage counterattack. His blows, a blend of speed and accuracy, landed with precision, each one sending Valerian reeling backward. For the first time in centuries, Valerian felt the sting of vulnerability, the shock of being on the defensive. No one has hit me in hundreds of years, and no one will again, Valerian snarled, regaining his composure. But the tide had turned. The battle that ensued was a vicious display of supernatural strength and agility, a dance of ancient powers between two formidable vampires. They moved like shadows, striking and parrying, their powers amplified by centuries of existence. The chamber echoed with the sounds of their combat, a testament to their otherworldly nature. Valerian, in his rage, unleashed the full extent of his powers, but Eldrich, guided by the talisman and his own resolve, matched him at every turn. The fight reached its climax as Eldrich, tapping into the depths of his strength and the talisman's energy, delivered a series of devastating blows. Valerian, overwhelmed and outmatched for the first time in his long and dark existence, faltered, with Eldrich standing victorious over a defeated Valerian. The once invincible predator lay at his feet, a symbol of the inevitable downfall of those who seek power at the expense of others. Eldrich, his chest heaving with exertion, stood tall, the power of the talisman still coursing through him. He had not only defeated Valerian, but had also upheld his own principles, proving that true strength lies in the ability to maintain one's values in the face of darkness. The battle was over, but the war against the shadows that plagued London was far from done. Chapter 9. The Virtue of Selfishness. In the aftermath of the fierce battle, Marcellus, his voice tinged with urgency, called out to Eldrich, "Give me the talisman!" Eldrich, holding the source of his newfound strength, hesitated. For a fleeting moment, he contemplated keeping the talisman. It had healed him, invigorated him with power, and perhaps it could even offer him the elusive peace he had longed for. But as he stood there, the philosophy that had guided him through his tormented existence came to the forefront of his mind, the virtue of selfishness. To Eldrich, selfishness was not the petty, narrow-minded pursuit of whims at the expense of others, as commonly misconceived. Instead, it was the recognition and pursuit of his own rational values, his own life and happiness as his moral purpose. Keeping the talisman, despite his benefits, would have been a betrayal of his core values, an act of self-sacrifice in disguise. With a sense of clarity and purpose, Eldrich tossed the talisman back to Marcellus. It was an act that, on the surface, might have seemed altruistic, but was, in fact, the embodiment of his own principles. By rejecting the temptation of the talisman, he upheld his integrity, his commitment to live not by the whims of the moment, but by the rational values he had chosen. The members of the cult of the night then gathered around the fallen Valerian, preparing a ritual to end him once and for all. The ritual was ancient and powerful, its origins lost in time. It involved the binding of the vampire's essence, severing his connection to the physical world and dispersing his being into the ether. As they chanted, in a language long forgotten by the modern world, a light enveloped Valerian, and his form began to dissipate, his centuries of terror finally coming to an end. Later, in his sanctuary, Eldrich spoke with Clara. She looked at him, a mix of admiration and confusion in her eyes. You could have had peace, yet you gave it up. Why? Eldrich's response was calm, yet there was a hint of pride in his voice. That, Clara, was the most selfish thing I have ever done. To live by one's values, to uphold one's integrity, even in the face of temptation, is the truest form of selfishness. It is the acknowledgement that my life and my principles are my highest values. Keeping the talisman would have been a betrayal of everything I stand for. Clara nodded, understanding dawning on her face. Eldrich's choice was a turning point, a reaffirmation of his existence on his own terms. In that moment, he had not only defeated a powerful adversary, but had also triumphed over the greatest challenge, the temptation to betray his own values. The story ends with Eldrich looking out into the night, his figure a silhouette against the backdrop of the city he had sworn to protect in his own way. He had chosen his path, one guided by the virtue of selfishness, a path that affirmed his existence as a being with a purpose, even in the face of eternal darkness.
And if you're still looking to fulfill your thirst for more horror, don't forget to check out this next video, unless of course you are frozen with fear already.